We're in the middle of another federal government shutdown, but what does that really mean, and how did we get here?
Well, just get it together. Just do what you're supposed to do, right? And you can have these debates about should this thing be bigger or that thing should be smaller or whatever, on your own time, but just keep the government operating.
On this episode, we dive into the politics and the policy implications of the budget impasse in Washington that led to the latest shutdown and how regular voters should respond. This is Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. This year, Sutherland Institute is celebrating its 30th anniversary, thanks to all those who support the work we do for Utah and our great nation. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking about the federal government shutdown and what impact it might have on various aspects of public policy. And to help us navigate this issue, I'm excited to welcome into the virtual studio Matt Weidinger. He's a senior fellow for the American Enterprise Institute. He's also a kind of a veteran of the U.S. Capitol Hill environment, worked for Ways and Means Committee, was there for close to 3 decades. And Matt, also a veteran of government shutdowns, you might say. So Matt, welcome to Defending Ideas.
Glad to be with you, Nick.
We're really excited to talk to you about this because I think this is one of those issues that maybe in longer trajectories, if you look at history of governance over decades, but certainly in recent years, it seems to be a more common thing that at times folks in Congress just can't get together when it comes to passing what they need to keep the government funded and functioning. And we found ourselves again in the middle of a federal government shutdown. And maybe I want to ask you first to I want to help our audience understand in more detail what is driving this latest shutdown. And obviously, if there's any context you want to offer about putting this shutdown in context of sort of broader examples in the past, we'll get into that as well. But maybe to start off, Matt, what is actually going on? We see the news headlines and we see people popping off on social media, but from your perspective, what do we need to understand about this shutdown?
So, maybe the first thing to do is sort of talk a little bit about what a shutdown means, right? So federal government has certain types of programs that always happen. They're sort of mandatory, often referred to as entitlements, and kind of without regard to the individual passage of laws involving what are called discretionary programs in any given year. Those programs always happen. So think Social Security, Medicare benefits, that sort of thing. Discretionary programs are not that. They are things that require the federal government every year. Congress has to look at these programs and say, well, we're going to choose the right amount of funding for these, or in some cases, maybe it's not going to be any funding at all. Like I said, those are called discretionary programs. And usually Congress needs to pass by the end of the fiscal year, which in Washington is September 30th, what's called an appropriations bills for that. And there are about a dozen appropriations bills for all the various things the federal government does. And when that doesn't happen, when those appropriations bills are not passed by the end of the fiscal year, something else has to happen. Either Congress passes what's normally called a continuing resolution, which is a numbingly boring term in the way that Washington does these things, that sort of kicks the can down the road and says, of these discretionary things that the federal government does and pays for, we're going to keep doing those for some period of time. Or if it doesn't do that, the government is shut down. Those discretionary activities come to a halt. And that's where we find ourselves right now. The sort of simple math in DC is Republicans control the House, Republicans control the Senate, but that's not enough to overcome this sort of math behind a shutdown. The House has passed a bill, a continuing resolution in September, that kicked the funding can down the road to the middle of November. The Senate, which has 53 Republicans and 47 Democrats, has voted on that a dozen times, but because Senate rules require 60 members to approve most legislation like that, it hasn't been passed. And the basic dynamic is you have all Republicans and a very small handful of Democrats, not the 7 that it takes to get from 53 Republicans to 60 overall that are supporting that CR so far. And so, that's the kind of basic dynamics of what's at work here. And we can talk about, what all that means and the, implications for individual programs and real human beings and all that. But that's the kind of nuts and bolts inside DC of what's going on with the shutdown right now.
Matt, that's incredibly helpful, actually. It's a very concise explanation for folks who might just be catching snippets of this in the news. I want to ask kind of another general question, sort of channeling the what I can only assume is widespread frustration or annoyance with the federal government at the fact that these things happen. And for context for that, in a previous role a number of years ago, I was a senior policy advisor for a member of the Salt Lake County Council. In our role working for the Salt Lake County Council, there were a number of things that we did, but arguably the most important of which was every fall going through the budget process and evaluating all the requests and past expenditures and passing a budget for the county to continue to function. And again, I would argue it's the most important thing we did because that's an incredibly important aspect of the legislative branch to, one, be a check on the executive, and two, obviously appropriate dollars to where they need to go. And at the state level, I've worked closely with the state legislature in various different capacities, and same kind of thing. At the end of the legislative session, passing a state budget is kind of the most important thing the legislature does in many respects. So it is a little bit frustrating or annoying to sort of have come from that background and say, we fought about a lot of things, but at the end of the day, we always passed a budget. Why does it seem so hard for Congress to, at the very least, just pass a budget?
I mean, that's an excellent question. And really, these sorts of shutdowns, I would argue, are sort of a symptom of a broader dysfunction. Like you said, one of the basic operations of government is to pass a budget, right? Pass a plan and pass the funding to implement that plan. Well, taking a step back, where do we find ourselves with Washington nowadays? In good times, we're running deficits of $2 trillion, right? That includes $1 trillion now in interest on all of the accumulated deficits from the past. So taxpayers today are literally making good on the sort of the benefit promises that have been made in the past that were not fully funded with revenues. So you have this like usual kind of, red versus blue, Republicans versus Democrat, conservative, liberal argument about like, what's the proper size of government? And the shutdown is really indicative of that coming to a head and policymakers not being willing to meet each other halfway. Like I said, in the Senate, especially with current numbers, it takes a little bit of bipartisanship, not a lot of bipartisanship, but a little bit of bipartisanship to overcome things like a shutdown. But, here we have this sort of, ongoing debate now in day, where are we, 27, where members cannot find agreement. And there's, all sorts of political dynamics behind this that go to life in the Trump era, but even more the nature of where the parties are today. And some of this, I can make a pretty coherent argument that a lot of this is really reflective of the leftward tilt of the Democrat Party, because you have, as I've written, we can talk about this in a little bit, you have basically the liberal Democrat base that is resisting some of their more moderate members agreeing with Republicans to reopen the government right now. And that's a unique and new dynamic, where in the past, often the sort of the conditions behind the shutdown, the reason why the shutdown came into being was because Republicans wanted to sort of force a policy rider to be added onto this, legislation that keeps the government up and running. We're in a totally different landscape now when it comes to that.
Can I ask you about that a little bit more, Matt? Because in my mind, I would say it's easy, I think, for some to look at this shutdown and say either it's just partisan politics run amok yet again, or there is a lot of messaging, which I want to talk about in the next segment, the messaging around specifically the Affordable Care Act tax credit extension debate that seems to be a sticking point. So I want to get into that in a minute. But first, on the political end, I guess the question would be, to what extent do you attribute this latest shutdown to it's just politics as usual yet again versus significant policy concerns? And maybe I'll mention, for context for our audience, you wrote a piece recently for the AEI Ideas blog called "Democrats Fear Their Liberal Base If They Vote to Reopen the Government." We'll include that link in the show notes so folks can go read it. But can you talk about that a little bit? To what extent are these kind of interesting political dynamics you're talking about sort of either causing this or furthering it?
I think the political dynamics are a significant part of what's going on here. And it's not something that you see reflected in your standard, oh, Republicans versus Democrats having the usual fights in Washington. Like I said, I think a significant part here is sort of a intramural squabble amongst Democrats. So you don't have to have too long of a memory to remember how we were sort of facing a partial shutdown earlier in the year because the continuing resolution from last year into this year was coming due in March. And the same sort of dynamics applied. We needed to have a certain number of Democrats to agree with mostly Republicans to keep the government up and running through roughly the end of March. And there was a drama within the Democrat Party about whether they were going to provide those votes. And the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer from New York, in the end, sort of, I think cave is probably the term that you would see in the political articles about this, agreed to let a certain number of Democrats side with Republicans to keep the government from shutting down in March. He took a ton of heat from his liberal base for that. And I think you're seeing that play out. Chuck Schumer also happens to be up for re-election next fall. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a very famous House member from his same state. I don't know if she's thrown her hat in the ring, but she's widely believed to be in the running to compete with him for the Democrat nomination for that Senate seat. Chuck Schumer, like all politicians, doesn't want to lose. So he's smart enough to recognize if he got himself in a lot of trouble in the spring for doing exactly what is expected now for some number of Democrats to be allowed to agree with Republicans to open the government up. And he certainly is smart enough to look at the polls that see 2/3 of Democrats amazingly support the shutdown, right? Like this is a Democrat on Democrat issue at the moment that is sort of masquerading as just another sort of standard Republican versus Democrat issue. So, I mean, the interior dynamics of the Democrat Party are fascinating. You'd spend a lot of time, looking and talking about that. But the bottom line is, this is a significant Democrat on Democrat issue, not just your standard Republican versus Democrat issue. So that's not the only thing that's driving it, but I would say at this point that is a more than 50% part of what's going on here.
That's interesting, and honestly, is not something I feel like is being talked about much publicly as far as the causes for this. I think it's being framed in the news media, from my perception, as a little bit more of a traditional right versus left debate over the ACA tax credits, which, like I said, I want to get to in the next segment. Maybe let's take a quick break, because when we come back, I think this first segment kind of encapsulates some of the dynamics, some of the political aspects of it. But just to tease the next part, I want to get into sort of what are the policy components that maybe at least contributed to the start of the shutdown, and also talk about how it's having some ripple effect into other areas, in particular of social welfare policy, because it seems to be having a significant effect there. So let's get into that right after this break. Again, this is Defending Ideas with Matt Weidinger of AEI. We'll be right back.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn. We're going to continue our conversation with AEI's Matt Weidinger about the federal shutdown and what it means for each of us and some of the political dynamics pushing it forward, and also some of the policy implications, in particular, how the shutdown might affect upward mobility and social welfare policy, an issue we talk about often on the show. But before we continue, I want to remind you, if you like what you're hearing today, please visit us at defendingideas.org. You can find access to this entire episode, as well as short clips and previous episodes that you can then share on your own social media platforms. You can also find Defending Ideas wherever you like to get your shows. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Wherever you watch or listen, just make sure to search for Defending Ideas and click subscribe. And if you are watching on YouTube, click the little bell icon on your screen there so you get a notification each time a new episode drops, which is every Tuesday morning. Again, all of that and more wherever you get your shows or at defendingideas.org. Matt, I want to pick up where we left off because there are obviously the political dynamics going on, but there's also some really important questions and debates and impacts of this federal shutdown with respect to, again, what I would call social welfare policy, sort of the various programs that might have a direct impact in particular to lower income Americans. And maybe to start, we recently saw in the news that various states, Utah is one of them, have announced that food stamp benefits, so the SNAP program, could run out in November. Essentially, beneficiaries of that program may not actually have access to those food stamp benefits in November because of the shutdown. So I want to ask you that as an example of the kinds of impact. What in your mind should we expect to see if this shutdown continues with respect to SNAP, other programs, Medicaid, TANF? I mean, what do we need to know when it comes to the safety net?
Right. So I think most of the articles have paid more attention to SNAP and WIC, the Women, Infant, and Children's Supplemental Nutrition Program lately. So you might ask yourself, why are we talking about November when the shutdown not only started in October? Short answer is federal government, some states were able to cobble together enough funding to continue some of these benefits, but eventually that sort of emergency pot will run dry, and so that's kind of where we find ourselves in the beginning of November. And the dynamics there are serious. You have 42 million individuals who are receiving SNAP in something like 20 million or so households. So that's a significant number of Americans. That's basically 1 in 8 residents of the country that you're talking about. So in some states, I think there's an effort for the states to come up with their own funding, but that's problematic because it's a large program that affects a lot of people. It provides, relatively generous benefits for food that, costs a fair amount of money. So, and if states haven't previously budgeted for this, there's complexity in that. So, in my mind, the SNAP deadline, this sort of looming, hey, if Congress doesn't do something to extend federal funding for these programs, by X date, then Y bad outcome will happen. That's a significant part of perhaps one of the drivers for Congress to come to some agreement and say, hey, we're going to end the shutdown and return to the status quo before. So we'll have to see. But, there's other dynamics at work here, too. You have federal employees who are not being paid. Though some of them, air traffic controllers, law enforcement individuals, they're going to work because they're essential, but they're still not being paid. This morning, I saw on the news, this is Monday morning, DC, that the largest federal employee union said that members should reopen the government, and so their union members can be paid. So there's all sorts of pressures that will, in the end, result in the shutdown coming to an end. I would say SNAP. I would say federal employment. In the past, it's been things like national parks or passports aren't being processed. All that stuff mixed together creates the political pressure behind one side or the other saying, hey, we have to draw this to an end and move on.
Matt, can we go back a little bit to the origin of what caused the shutdown? The narrative in the mainstream press, at least, is sort of articulating, how this started. What seemed to be a debate over tax credits as part of the Affordable Care Act to help alleviate the costs of medical coverage. So if folks are kind of hearing snippets of that in the press, and again, the story is basically that Democrats want to extend this benefit in some way. Republicans say, no, this is not part of the continuing resolution. We passed a clean CR. So can you just walk us through that debate? Is that an accurate depiction of one of the major sticking points that started this, and what do we need to know to understand that better?
Sure. You're right. That's how it's characterized in the media. That's certainly the argument that I would say most Democrats want people to take away from this experience. With a little bit of background on previous shutdowns, the basic dynamic is usually one side says, hey, we want what's called a clean CR. We want to basically kick the current funding can down the road, no changes, just whatever the current level of funding is. We're going to keep doing that for some period of weeks, months, sometimes even as long as a year. The other side usually says, you know what? We're not for that because we want something else to happen. We want some policy change to be made that is added to that in some fashion. That side asking for those policy riders of, however you want to call it, the amendment or the change or whatever, usually it's the minority party. They're the party that's on the outs in terms of their political clout. And so, at least in terms of who's in control of the White House, and does that party have enough numbers to pass something through one or the other legislative bodies? So historically, this question has been Republicans have had the shoe on their foot when it comes to insisting on a policy rider of one form or another, instead of the clean CR, the sort of reasonable position that Democrats have previously occupied. So now the tables are turned, and Democrats are insisting on a policy addition to the clean CR. You can look at that policy addition and say, does that make sense? One way in which you could say, well, it doesn't make that much sense is the policy was added. So these expanded Affordable Care Act tax credits, basically a subsidy to make insurance purchased on the healthcare exchanges created by the Affordable Care Act more affordable, right? The background on that says insurance isn't getting more affordable, so the government should subsidize that more. That's been kind of the Democrat take. In the pandemic, in the American Rescue Plan, Democrats created these expanded credits. No Republicans voted for it at that point. Then that was in 2021. In 2022, the Democrats, in a bill that no Republicans voted for, extended those credits through the end of this calendar year. So again, no Republicans voting for that. Now Democrats are saying, aha, we have a point of leverage, that is the shutdown, where we can say, no, we're not going to be for extending government operations unless Republicans agree to basically extending a Democrat-only policy. So, here you have this sort of tables being turned in terms of the legislative give and take, where it used to be Republicans insisting on things being added to keep the government open. Now, for the first time in a long time, it's Democrats insisting on something being added in order for the government to keep its operations open. Basically, the Republican position on that is agree to reopen the government. We'll talk to you about those credits. And Democrats so far have resisted. How long will they be able to resist when things like people are not going to start getting SNAP benefits, food stamp benefits, federal workers continue not to be paid, other things fail to happen? That's anybody's guess, but I think we're starting to get to the point where those forces are having some real political impact on the folks who have said, hey, we want the government to be shut down. So we'll see, but hopefully this won't be too long before people come to their senses and say, we can have this debate. We just need to have this debate when we actually have a functioning government where it's doing the things that legislators have promised it will do.
Matt, one of the things that comes to mind for me hearing you kind of give that description is that this seems like, and correct me if I'm off base here, but this seems like just kind of an example of a little bit of breakdown in governance in Congress, where and as you've said, it's happened on both sides. It's been Republicans in the past, now it's Democrats that are essentially, whichever party is in the minority will use the need to pass a continuing resolution to fund the government as you said, a point of leverage. Is it kind of like, well, we don't have the numbers, we don't have the majority, there isn't a way for us to get our preferred policy wins implemented unless we use this budget process as sort of the political leverage point. It seems like it's just a symptom of those kinds of debates should be happening in other ways, in sort of appropriate settings and contexts. That's not happening because, again, just as an outsider would perceive it as a breakdown of just good governance when it comes to Congress. And when I say good governance, I don't mean agreement. I mean, Congress should be able to disagree and find compromise and consensus where they can to pass things. And it seems like the normal, traditional good governance that we would hope and expect from Congress has completely broken down. And so then we are forced into having these policy fights in these political leverage points, which add to all these other frustrations and complications of government shutdowns. Is that the right reading of it? And if so, how would you fix it? How would you go to Congress and say, here's how we avoid having these political flashpoints, but still have these debates that various sides want in the proper context?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and it's very well put. I'm not sure I have a fix for that. And part of it, one of the things that I've seen in my experience in Congress. So I started working on Capitol Hill in 1990. Um, in the 1994 elections, Republicans took the House majority for the first time in 40 years. So when I first started working on Capitol Hill, it was the Democrat mindset that we will always be in the majority. Um, and since then, the majority has changed hands a number of times. And currently, we have one of the narrowest majorities in the House in U.S. history. So, just like there is this debate among Democrats over, in effect, whose vision will prevail? Will it be Chuck Schumer's vision, or will it be AOC's vision as the Senate candidate from New York next year? And how far left will that vision be on the part of the Democrat candidate? You have a whole universe of members now who are a couple of races away from becoming chairman and thinking that they will be writing the rules and they will be passing legislation and they will be the ones in charge in the next Congress if a couple of Republicans are knocked off in the case of the House. So I think that nature, that Congress has gone back and forth. The margin is very narrow. If we just throw enough sand in the gears of the operation of government right now, we'll make our political point, appeal to our base, and they will turn out and vote for us and not the other guy or gal in the next election, and then we will be in charge. That to me, that's a not trivial part of what has gone on in the last couple of decades, that you now have both parties that think, hey, they're just a couple of races away from being in charge of things. And so the incentive to stop things from happening is almost as great as the incentive to make things happen. And we see this over and over, and shutdowns are just sort of one manifestation of this. But the federal debt and deficits, I would say, is another, where it's always easier to come up with one more spending program or one more gimmick that adds more spending or tax cuts on the Republican side. And it's always harder to negotiate, hey, we should save money over here. Or, hey, maybe this group over here should be paying more revenue so we can support this activity, on this side of the ledger. So all of this, I think, has congealed into producing less cooperation, less incentive for cooperation, and more of this type of dysfunction that the shutdown is really sort of the ultimate sort of evidence of that.
Matt, last question for this segment, and I apologize for asking you what may be a big question in just a couple minutes left of this segment. And then in our last segment, I want to get to sort of lessons learned and sort of next steps and maybe bigger implications for Congress moving forward. But before we go to break, the sticking point of the ACA tax credits, as you mentioned, I want to ask you, is that a conversation that should be had? Should we as a nation, should Congress talk about, is there some merit to extending those tax credits, or does it just simply point to other bigger conversations we need to have about healthcare policy and specifically affordability of health insurance, especially for low-income families? And the second part of that question is it appropriate to have that conversation now, or would you say no, that they should sort of pass a clean CR, if you will, and then yes, have that debate, but later?
So let me take the is it appropriate to have this conversation now question first, because that's kind of embedded in the shutdown dynamic. The answer, yeah, Congress can have these discussions whenever they want, but Congress has known since 2022 that there was going to come at the end of this year the expiration of these expanded ACA credits. Democrats have just said, since we haven't gotten our way, since we haven't negotiated, compromised, whatever was necessary to force that onto the agenda to this point, we are going to say we're going to shut down the government come October 1st. So, yeah, you can have that conversation now. I think the Republican position is a reasonable one that says, hey, we should function like adults here and have an open government and not be forcing issues that are sort of timely, but not, necessarily timed with the October 1st shutdown of the government onto the agenda here because that's what the minority wants. So, it is a completely legitimate argument. I think there is, even the Democrat argument that these subsidies are needed is in effect an admission the Affordable Care Act is doing less than advertised. Insurance is becoming increasingly unaffordable. I saw a statistic the other day, like the average insurance policy for a family of four obtained through an employer is costs like $27,000. It's fabulously expensive. It's way more expensive than it was when the Affordable Care Act was passed. And many of the failings of that legislation and our underlying healthcare system to address those concerns about affordability back when that happened, now 15 years ago, are behind this debate we're having now. So absolutely, we need to have a debate about this because it hurts everything. It hurts competitiveness. It hurts families' bottom line. It hurts businesses' bottom lines. It hurts the government's bottom line. It contributes significantly to our underlying debt and deficit issues. So yeah, we definitely have to have a debate about that. The question is, should that debate close the government or not? And I would argue, have that debate, but don't do it at the risk of everything else the government is doing. And like you said, there are implications for low-income people. There are implications for upper-income people. One of the sort of strange dynamics here is the expanded Affordable Care Act credits that we're talking about. One of the expansions is to make them available to people earning more than 400% of the poverty line. So this is, generally people who are well enough off that government benefits should not be targeted to them. But that was one of the decisions the Democrats made on a partisan basis in 2021 and 2022 to expand these credits to those folks. You can have that argument, but in terms of proper targeting, is it affordable? Does it make good policy sense? That's the kind of thing that Congress should be debating, but it shouldn't be debating a sort of my way or the highway when it comes to extending this, what in its origin was really a partisan set of policies that now is the difference between having the government open or not.
Well, Matt, let's take a quick break. In our last segment, like I said, I want to kind of talk about what's next and lessons learned and maybe equip our audience with some things that they can think about as they might find themselves in discussions or even debates about these kinds of issues moving forward. So let's take a quick break before we get into our final segment with Matt Weidinger from AEI, talking about the federal shutdown and what it means for all of us here on Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn. We're going to jump back to the conversation, but want to remind you to subscribe to Defending Ideas wherever you get your shows, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you watch or listen. Search for Defending Ideas and click subscribe. New episodes every Tuesday. Matt, I want to finish off our conversation with sort of a moving forward kind of lens of, as you've said, you are the veteran, if you will, of multiple government shutdowns over the years. And we're in the middle of this now, but moving forward, I want to ask for your take on what lessons should policymakers take from this? Should voters take from this? What do we make of all this that can help inform public policy and budgetary debates in the future to hopefully improve them in some way?
Well, I mean, I think one thing that voters say might take from this is, and this is really hard to do because I think people don't sort of tend to view politics through this lens, is consider closely the type of people that they elect, right? There are increasing polarization between the parties. The Republicans are tending to be more conservative, more Trumpy, if you will. Democrats definitely trending more liberal. As the parties go to their respective corners, it's harder and harder to find agreement. And as I suggested earlier on, there's some sort of internal dynamics of the nature of partisan power in DC that drives the parties towards disagreement, right? If you are a member of the current minority who thinks you're a couple of seats away from being in the majority next time, and maybe you're going to be a chairman of a subcommittee and getting to write bills and laws theoretically to do X, Y, or Z, well, you really don't have much incentive to cooperate today. You have more incentive to not cooperate today So the current majority looks like they don't have their act together. So, from a voter standpoint, some of that just means be careful about who you elect. And if people talk about um, maybe maybe compromising isn't always a bad word, that those types of folks are people that folks should throw their support to. That's not going to work everywhere, but it's just worth sort of people thinking about what's the nature of individuals that you elect. Are they the type of people who want to reach compromise to do the sort of basic things that the government does without massive deficits or whatever the other criteria you have when you go to the polls?
Matt, something that occurs to me just now as you're describing that kind of relates back to the political incentives as you're describing for candidates for office. And I guess I want to ask you, is there a way that we can, as a nation, shift the political incentives when it comes to election time such that a member of Congress who has a track record of finding consensus solutions, and I know compromise has become such a controversial term. So many feel so often to say, well, it's not a dirty word. It should be viewed as positively. And I think there are folks out there who are worried that compromise means I'm sort of giving in on things I care about to a political opposition that I don't particularly like or trust. That seems to be kind of the mentality. But is there a way as a nation that we can shift the political incentives to where the kind of member of Congress who is able to forge some consensus-based solutions to some of these issues, that's actually politically advantageous for them to help them with re-election? Can we shift the incentives in that way?
Boy, I wish I had a good answer for that. Like I said, I think that ultimately boils down to individuals making, sort of expecting this of their elected officials. Um, there's there's a way in which, so we have a representative government. It's not a pure democracy in the sense that the people we send to Washington, vote 100% of the time in agreement with their constituents. They're supposed to make informed judgments when push comes to shove on individual bills. That's a good thing because the founders talked about the passions of the majority and and all that. You could go read the Federalist Papers and review that. But there's a way in which politicians definitely reflect, the voters of their districts. And we're having a national debate about what's the nature of those districts when you see all these redistricting arguments and all that. But in the end, the laws of gravity, the laws of budgeting will affect the decisions those members are able to make. So if the budget deficit gets so high that we can no longer afford the benefit promises that individuals have made. The laws of budgetary gravity say something's going to have to give. You're going to either have to raise taxes, you're going to have to cut benefits somewhere, or people are going to face higher inflation, higher interest rates, all sorts of bad things will happen. I would love to say that there is a political theory, political science way that we will elect better members. I think in the end, in our lifetimes, Nick, unfortunately, members are going to be forced to make better decisions than they have in the past because we're not going to be able to afford to make a lot of the unaffordable decisions that the last generation of members have made. That feels a little bit like being on the Titanic and cheering on the iceberg, but in the sense, I think there will be more discipline enforced on the federal government to make better decisions with people's tax dollars than politicians have been making for a while, independent of whether we can figure out some way to elect better members. So that may be a really pessimistic way of answering your question, but I think in some ways, better decisions will be forced on members because we won't be able to afford the really poor decision-making that's gone on for entirely too long in this town.
Matt, we've got just 30 or seconds or so left. I want to ask you kind of a final thought as we wrap up this conversation. And this has all been amazingly helpful context, I think, for our audience to understand this issue and what to make of it as voters. And in that mindset, talking to voters, kind of what I take away from all this, and I want to test this with you and ask you to clarify or improve where needed, is that perhaps an ultimate pitch to voters should be, you should want people in elected office who are willing to make quote unquote good decisions now, regardless of what the political makeup is in Congress and the White House and so on, rather than elected officials who want to obstruct until they have more power or following an election or a committee assignment or something like that. Find people who say, we need to find positive steps forward in a consensus way now, rather than holding out for, well, maybe if I obstruct now, I can get something better later. Is that a fair summation, or is that too pie in the sky?
No, I don't think that's too pie in the sky at all. I mean, really, if you think about what the nature of the shutdown is, it is the Congress and, the White House, because the president plays a role here, has basically failed at the most elemental responsibility of the federal government. That is kind of keep the lights on, right? Like the stuff that has to happen every year for basic government operations to go on, for national parks to be open, for passports to be processed, for federal employees to do their thing, for food stamp benefits to be paid, and various things like that. For that to happen, you got to pass a bill that the president signs into law, and that is the bare minimum that taxpayers should expect of their government in Washington. And these folks haven't been able to do that. And we've talked about the various political reasons and all that. That's great and everything, but from a taxpayer standpoint, I think most people's attitude is, well, just get it together. Just do what you're supposed to do, right? And you can have these debates about should this thing be bigger or that thing should be smaller or whatever, on your own time, but just keep the government operating. And, if it's too much, cut it. If it's too little, increase it, but find a way to do your jobs. And, really, I think that's kind of the disappointment that most people feel. It's probably too weak of a term, but the disappointment people feel on looking at the shutdown, where they just say, can't these guys just get it together? This is the bare minimum that government should do to be able to keep the lights on.
Well, Matt, we will leave it there. I'm going to choose to be optimistic that everything you just described as far as an approach to better governance will come to pass, and I think it starts with all of us here on Defending Ideas and reflecting that in the way we vote and interact with our elected officials. So, Matt, thank you so much for your time and expertise on this issue. Once again, that's Matt Weidinger with American Enterprise Institute here on Defending Ideas. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Nick. Appreciate it.
We're going to take one final break before we leave you all with some talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back. I want to thank AEI's Matt Weidinger for lending us his time and expertise so you and I can better understand the political dynamics and the policy implications of the federal shutdown. And here are some talking points that you and I can use if we find ourselves discussing this with others. First, I think you and I are right to feel frustrated when this kind of thing happens. I've worked at the county and state level in the past, and one of the most fundamental tasks of any legislative body is to pass a budget. It can certainly feel annoying, to say the least, for regular voters to see this happen yet again. And when we see some of the very real policy impacts of this ongoing lapse in government funding for various programs, such as the fact that food stamp funds may be running out in November, this directly harms low-income families, and it's particularly frustrating to see what feels like, to you and I, political partisanship continuing to contribute to this problem. But if you and I are expecting members of Congress to be reasonable, practical, and be willing to come together to find consensus to pass, ideally, a real budget, but at the very least, a reasonable continuing resolution, we have to be willing to also be reasonable and practical as voters and hungry for consensus and compromise when we vote for our elected officials, which leads me to my second point. You and I need to take our responsibility as voters seriously so that when we select our elected officials at the ballot box, we are choosing people who are willing and able to find real consensus, at times reaching compromise across party lines, and people who are willing to remain anchored to sound principle while also striving for pragmatic, good governance. We can't complain that members of Congress aren't able to set aside politics and find consensus to govern if we don't do the same when we vote for them in the first place. We should still disagree and be honest and clear about our disagreements, but take the attitude that we want elected officials who are willing to pursue good progress on important issues right now, regardless of which parties are in power, and if possible, find consensus, rather than those who simply obstruct and wait for more favorable political conditions. It's a really tough balance and something that we'll probably get wrong often, but we need to try and shift the political incentives so that principled, pragmatic pursuit of consensus, where possible, is an asset rather than a liability. That's it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed the discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. Don't forget to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you like to get your shows, and please share this episode on your own social media profiles or with a friend, family member, or coworker who may find it interesting. And lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.